With us now, CNN senior political commentator Scott Jennings and Democratic strategist Matt Bennett. Matt, I just want to start with you because I am sure you have been talking to Democrats in and around Washington lately. Where do you think the momentum is this morning as House Democrats head to this closed-door meeting?
Yeah, I think this is changing in an hour-by-hour way. And I think what we saw yesterday with the president's letter to Congress and the very strong support that he got from the Congressional Black Caucus, as we heard from Congressman Ivey, it's pretty clear at this point that there is not the will in Congress to, have that hard conversation with the president at this moment. However, what I hear from everyone, what we're hearing from senators and others, is that the president has got to do more. It's been a week and a half since the debate. He's only done one interview with George Stephanopoulos and then a couple with some radio hosts, and very little else that has been off teleprompter. A couple of events with supporters and voters, but not that much. He's got to go out and do town hall meetings. He's got to do the big press conference on Thursday. He's got to do more sit-downs with the press to show that, as Nancy Pelosi said, this was an episode and not a condition. And we just don't know the answer to that quite yet.
Well, talk to me a little bit more about that, the Show Us More caucus, Matt, if you will. Because what are they saying? Are they saying they want him out on the stage so they can judge further, so that he can fight his way back? Is he on a sort of a no strikes and you're out policy at this point? One more slip up and then they would come out definitively?
Well, no, it's not going to be one more slip up. I think what he has to show is a pattern that he can manage the job of running for president. That is the real question before us right now. Can he prosecute the case against Donald Trump and do what needs to be done to win this incredibly important election? And I think what that will require is him going out and doing unscripted things. He does a great job when he speaks off a teleprompter. We saw that in the day after the debate. What we don't know yet is whether he can kind of get back on his feet in an unscripted way, because the debate showed that was a super bad night, but we just don't know if he can kind of recover from that and do what he needs to do in an unscripted way going forward.
Scott Jennings, I love having you around, but you don't get a vote here. So I've been struggling to what to ask you about this that doesn't elicit just keep on doing this, extend this as long as it can. So let me ask you this. If you were Donald Trump, do you want to face Joe Biden in the general election? Would you rather face him or someone else at this point?
Yeah, I mean, he's probably their worst candidate right now. I mean, some of the polling that's out this morning from some Democratic firm out there shows Kamala Harris doing a little bit better against Trump than Joe Biden. But at the same time, Biden, I don't think they can run him out of the race. I mean, he's got the delegates. He won the primary.
But that's a different question.
So
I do think that is a different issue. Whether or not they can do it is a different issue. But if you're a Republican who wants Donald Trump to win, and this is actually an important question for Democrats to hear the answer to. If you're a Republican who wants Trump to win, do you think it's easier to beat Biden than beating somebody else?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, his approval rating is about 37% in aggregate if you look at the trackers. He is obviously facing internal divisions in his own party right now. His unfitness for office is on full display. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the big cover-up that went on to hide his infirmities from the public. And there are anecdotes in there about him skipping meetings with world leaders because he had to go to bed. I mean, everybody now knows his record brought him to a point of a 37% approval, and at the same time, he has become manifestly unfit for office. So if I'm Donald Trump, absolutely, I want to run against Joe Biden because the country is obviously already soured on him, and it will be very hard for Biden to rebuild that trust with the American people.
Now, on a purely Republican question here, in terms of who Donald Trump picks as a running mate, there's some thinking out there that what's happened on the Democratic side might impact his thinking. Right, he may not need as quote-unquote safe of a pick that might have been North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum here, and Trump might be willing to pick somebody who appeals more directly to conservatives and the right of the party like J.D. Vance. What do you think about that?
I think that Donald Trump needs to pick the person who helps him win against Joe Biden, and I think Donald Trump needs to pick someone who can handle the job of president should something happen to him if he wins the election. I mean, this is another problem the Democrats have right now, is there's not a ton of confidence in Kamala Harris either. I mean, I think that's one of the things going on in the Democratic Party is that Biden has become infirm, but there's not a lot of confidence that she would be much better. Her job approval is about what his is. So if you're Donald Trump, you need a governing partner, someone who can do the job should something happen to you. But for the campaign purposes, pick somebody who can help you win. Do not assume this is in the bag. Pick somebody who's going to be the most broadly appealing to the American people, and do no harm. That's the number one rule of all this. Do no harm in picking a vice president.
Matt, very quickly to you, part of what the White House and Biden campaign have been doing is messaging, I think, subliminally to Democrats here, which is that if you're going to want Biden to go, it's going to be really hard. We're going to make it really, really hard for you. There will be blood. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that if he goes, it is almost certain that Vice President Harris would get the nomination. There's a lot of kind of Aaron Sorkin fan fiction out there about how we could have some process between now and the convention to open it up, but I think that's basically silly. We have a vice president, and she almost certainly would be the nominee. What I have heard recently, though, is a lot of support for her. If the president does decide to step aside, I think the party would unify behind her very quickly in ways that might have been surprising several months ago, but have changed since.
Matt Bennett, Scott Jennings, thanks to both of you. Kate?